There is one habit making you sound weaker. Most people do it every single day. They don't notice it. What if the very sentence you use to sound careful is the exact thing destroying you? You say it before almost every important thought, without noticing, without meaning to, completely on autopilot. It's not your tone, it's not your posture, it's not even what people usually blame first. By the end of this video, you'll hear it everywhere, in your own voice, in every conversation, and you won't be able to unhear it again. Stay through this, because the fix is small, almost embarrassingly small, but almost nobody names it correctly. Here's the habit. Prefacing your own statements with a disclaimer that quietly tells people not to trust what you're about to say before you even say it. This might sound stupid, but I could be wrong here, but not to be that person, but sorry to bother you. You've said some version of this constantly, probably today, maybe multiple times, without even registering it. Here's why this single habit does more damage than almost anything else you could be doing. Researchers studying framing effects found something specific decades ago. The first piece of information a listener receives shapes how every piece of information after it gets interpreted, even when that first piece is completely irrelevant to whether the rest is true. This is sometimes called anchoring, and it was studied extensively by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Their research showed that an initial number, or an initial frame, distorts every judgment that follows it, even among people who consciously know the anchor is arbitrary and should have no bearing at all. Now apply this directly to your own speech. When you open with, "This might sound stupid," you've just planted an anchor in the listener's mind. The anchor says, expect something weak, expect something wrong, expect something not worth full attention here. Everything you say after that gets filtered through that anchor. Regardless of how strong your actual point is, you could deliver the single smartest sentence in the entire conversation, and it would still land softer, weaker, less credible. Simply because of the frame you built for it 3 seconds earlier. This isn't about confidence as some vague personality trait. It's a measurable structural problem with how information gets received once a negative anchor is already set. Here's a second mechanism, and it's psychological. Not just about how listeners process your words specifically. Psychologists Edward Jones and Stephen Berglas studied something called self-handicapping decades ago in a landmark study. Self-handicapping is when someone preemptively creates an excuse for potential failure before that failure even happens. Not consciously, not deliberately, but as an automatic protective reflex against the pain of being wrong. This might sound stupid, is a verbal form of self-handicapping. If the idea lands badly, you've already warned everyone, so the failure feels smaller. If the idea lands well, you get a pleasant surprise. Either way, you've protected yourself somewhat. But here's the cost nobody calculates in the moment. Every single time you do this, you're training listeners to expect less from you by default. You're not protecting your image, you're slowly eroding it. One disclaimer at a time without ever noticing the damage until it's already deeply established. Here's a third layer, and this one's physical, not just psychological. It's about your actual voice. Watch what happens to most people's vocal energy during a disclaimer specifically. The volume often drops, and the pace often speeds up slightly. Almost like rushing past something embarrassing to get to safety. That physical pattern, quieter, faster, doesn't just disappear once the disclaimer ends. It often bleeds directly into the actual point that follows right after it. So even if your point itself is delivered clearly, it's riding on the exact same vocal energy that just signaled uncertainty. Listeners don't consciously track this, but their brains absolutely register it. The entire sentence gets colored by the vocal energy that opened it, not just the specific words used in the disclaimer itself. Let's make this concrete with an actual example. Picture a meeting. Someone has a genuinely strong idea. They open with, "This is probably a dumb Python question, but have we considered changing the launch date?" The room barely responds. Someone mutters a vague acknowledgement, and the conversation moves on almost immediately. Now picture the same idea. Same person. Different. Opening. "I think we should change the launch date." Full stop. direct. No disclaimer attached anywhere at all. The room engages immediately. Follow-up questions arrive. Someone says, "That's actually a really good point." Same idea, same person, same voice, completely different. Reception. Because the anchor changed, nothing else did. Here's a mistake people make once they learn. They try to remove the disclaimer entirely, but keep every other habit exactly the same. Rushing their words, avoiding eye contact, shrinking their posture, and then wonder why the fix didn't work. The disclaimer was never the entire problem by itself. It was the clearest, most visible symptom of a deeper pattern, removing just the words without addressing the rushed pace or the physical, shrinking underneath them, only fixes about a third of what's actually happening in that exact moment. Here's a second mistake: overcorrecting into something that sounds robotic or falsely confident. Forcing a flat, overly rehearsed tone that feels stiff and unnatural. Listeners can detect forced confidence almost as easily as they detect genuine uncertainty. The goal was never sounding like a completely different person. Suddenly, it's removing the specific anchor while keeping your actual natural voice and personality fully intact otherwise. Here's a third mistake worth naming directly: applying this only in low-stakes situations, where being wrong doesn't feel scary, while reverting to heavy disclaimers the moment real stakes actually show up. This means the new pattern never gets tested under real pressure, only in situations that were already comfortable and safe before you even started. Here's what actually works, and it's simpler than you'd expect, but it requires real repeated practice. First, notice the disclaimer before it fully leaves your mouth. This takes practice. Most people don't even register they're doing it until months into. Paying close, deliberate attention to their own speech. Second, replace the disclaimer with a brief pause. Instead, silence costs you nothing. A disclaimer costs. You undermine your credibility every time you use it. Third, if you genuinely want to signal openness to being wrong, do it after your statement, not before it. Saying, "I think we should change the launch date though I'm open to other views," lands completely differently than leading with the doubt. When the anchor is your actual point, the doubt becomes an addition instead of the entire frame the listener receives first. Fourth, pay attention to your pace specifically during moments where you'd normally add a disclaimer. Slow down instead of speeding up through the discomfort. The urge to rush is the exact same nervous energy that used to produce the disclaimer itself. Redirect that energy into a slower, steadier pace. Fifth, practice this specifically in slightly uncomfortable situations, not just safe ones. The old pattern only fully reveals itself under actual real pressure. This habit doesn't only live in your spoken voice. It shows up constantly in text messages, emails, and Slack messages everywhere you communicate at all. Watch your own messages sometime, like, "Just wondering if," "Sorry, quick question," and "This is probably nothing but." Every single one of these is the exact same anchor, just typed instead of spoken aloud. Typed disclaimers might actually be worse because there's no vocal tone to soften them. They sit there in permanent visible text, coloring how every word after them gets read. A manager scanning 50 messages a day reads, "Sorry to bother you, but can we push the deadline?" completely differently than they read, "We need to push the deadline." Even though the actual request underneath both messages is identical word for word. Here's why competent, capable people do this constantly, more than people who actually have weaker ideas. It seems backwards, but it isn't once you understand the actual mechanism driving the behavior itself. People who notice nuance, who understand how much they still don't know, who take their own competence seriously enough to worry about getting it wrong are exactly the people most likely to do this. Some people hedge their statements with disclaimers out of genuine intellectual honesty, not out of actual incompetence. Meanwhile, people with less actual expertise often speak with far more unearned certainty and no disclaimer attached. They haven't yet learned enough to know what they don't know. This creates a strange inversion where the most careful, most thoughtful people in a room sound the least credible. Meanwhile, the least careful people sound the most confident. This is not a reason to become falsely certain about things you're genuinely unsure of. That would trade one problem for a worse one entirely. Instead, separate genuine uncertainty about content, which is fine to express clearly and directly, from reflexive verbal shrinking, which adds nothing useful. Reflexive verbal shrinking only costs you credibility every single time. There is a difference between saying, "I am not fully sure about this data point, let us verify it," and prefacing everything with self-demeaning disclaimers. One is honest, specific, and useful information. The other is a reflex that undermines you before you begin. Let us add a real scenario with friends instead of work or family. Picture a friend group planning a trip together. Someone has a genuinely good idea about where to stay and opens with, "This is probably a weird idea, but what if we looked at that other neighborhood instead?" The group barely engages, and someone changes the subject within a few seconds. Later, a different friend suggests almost the exact same neighborhood without a disclaimer, and suddenly, everyone is interested. People start pulling up listings, asking questions, and becoming genuinely engaged with the idea. This happens in friend groups just as often as it happens at work, and sometimes more often. Friend groups often have long-established informal status patterns that got set years ago without anyone consciously deciding who gets heard. Here is an expanded version of the actual protocol worth practicing deliberately over the next several weeks. Start by simply counting your disclaimers for one full day, not fixing them yet, just noticing. Count how many times you say "sorry," "this might sound dumb," or "I could be wrong" across an entire day. Most people are shocked by the actual number once they start counting it consciously for the first time. Next, pick one specific context, just one, like work meetings, family conversations, or your friend group. Practice removing the disclaimer only in that one context first, rather than trying to fix every conversation at once. Once it feels more natural in that one context, expand to a second context, then a third. This gradual approach works better than trying to overhaul your communication style overnight. Old patterns are deeply automatic, and automatic patterns get rebuilt through repetition, not willpower alone. Here's something worth naming directly because it reframes this entire habit in a way that matters. This disclaimer usually isn't really about the idea you're sharing at all. It's about an old fear of being seen as wrong or stupid. That fear was built long before this specific meeting or relationship even existed. Somewhere earlier, being wrong publicly cost you something like embarrassment, criticism, or dismissal. Your nervous system built a small verbal shield to soften that impact in advance, just in case it happened again. That shield made sense once and may have even protected you at some earlier point in your life. But it's costing you now, every single day, in rooms where the actual risk is far smaller than your nervous system believes. There's a close cousin of this habit worth naming separately, because it works almost the same way. It shows up after your statement, instead of before it, as over-justifying or immediately explaining yourself. You begin defending a statement nobody actually challenged in the first place. You say something direct, "I think we should change the launch date." Then, without any pushback at all, you immediately add, "I mean, it's just a thought. You probably know better than me. I could totally be wrong about this." That trailing justification undoes the strong opening completely. It retroactively applies the same anchor just a few seconds later than usual. The listener's brain updates its judgment backward, reinterpreting your confident opening. This often happens because the silence right after speaking feels unbearable. The same discomfort that produces the original disclaimer also produces this trailing version. It is just relocated to the other end of the sentence. The fix here is the same fix. Tolerate the silence. Let your statement simply sit there without needing to soften it retroactively. Resist the urge to fill the quiet with justification nobody actually asked you for. There is a physical component worth practicing directly, separate from the words entirely. Next time you feel the urge to add a disclaimer, notice what is happening in your body in that exact moment. Often there is a small tightening, a held breath, a slight forward lean almost like bracing for impact. Before speaking, try one slow breath instead. Let your shoulders drop slightly. Let your exhale finish completely before the first word leaves your mouth. This is not about performing calm. It is about actually interrupting the physical bracing pattern. That bracing pattern produces the rushed, quiet, apologetic vocal energy discussed earlier. A body that is not bracing for impact speaks with steadier, clearer energy, differently than a body that is, even when. The words on paper are exactly identical either way. Over time, this practice compounds in a way that matters more than any single conversation might suggest. Every disclaimer you don't say is a small piece of evidence your own nervous system collects, proving that speaking directly didn't actually lead to disaster, that the room didn't turn hostile, that being wrong occasionally, without a pre-built excuse, was survivable. And that evidence accumulates slowly into something that starts to feel like genuine confidence. Not performed confidence, but the real quiet kind. That doesn't need constant defending because it was never actually as fragile as the old habit made it feel. Here's the honest summary of everything covered here. The disclaimer feels like humility, but it functions like self-sabotage, quietly trained into your speech through repetition until it became completely automatic and invisible to you. It works through anchoring, coloring everything you say after it. Through self-handicapping, protecting you from a failure that mostly exists in your imagination now. And through vocal energy, bleeding uncertainty into words that could otherwise stand completely on their own. None of this means you're actually less capable, or that your ideas are actually weaker than anyone else's in the room. It means one specific verbal habit has been quietly undercutting you before anyone even had the chance to properly evaluate what you were about to say to them. Remove the disclaimer, keep the pause, protect your pace, and let your actual point arrive first, exactly as strong as it already was, before you ever learn to apologize for having it. Nothing about this requires becoming louder or colder, or someone you don't recognize in the mirror. It simply requires letting your actual words stand on their own without the small automatic apology attached to them for years. The idea was never weak. The delivery just kept telling everyone, including yourself, that it was. If you caught yourself doing this while watching this even once, that recognition is the entire starting point. Subscribe because this channel breaks down exactly this kind of pattern every single week.